There we go. So I'd like to start by giving a quick introduction of two aspects this evening. The first one is, this is one of our webinars hosted by the Institute of Risk Management. And I just wanted to mention the IRM is a UK body. I will put on the chat what the website is. It's www.theirm.org. It's a UK body of risk management professionals. It's headquartered in the UK, but we have a couple of regional groups, and this is the East Africa Regional Group. And this evening, we are going to be hosting a very short semi-webinar focusing on the need that many of us have. For many of us who've joined this call this evening, this is on elections preparedness. And we have with us Declan Galvin from Insight Consulting. And, you know, we shared Declan's profile a few days ago. I just want to read it very quickly, even as we start, so that you all get to understand who Declan is. So Declan is the head of Insight, Information and Intelligence at WS Insight, and an expert on political, security, and terror-related risks in East Africa. And WS Insight is a leading advisory firm that looks at security management. It works with embassies, private companies, humanitarian groups, and NGOs. Declan is a highly experienced investigator, analyst, and intelligence manager, supplying commercial and diplomatic audiences with security information and risk advisory solutions. And he leads the 3I team, which is made up of about 17 dedicated security intelligence professionals covering the entire of East Africa and the Horn of Africa. Declan is the lead on threat information and risk analysis for Insight's Election Preparedness Services package. He has published or has been quoted in Foreign Policy Magazine, Democracy in Africa, The Nation, The Week Magazine, and a couple of other media outlets. He's also the chairman of KEPSA's Election Preparedness Committee and a board member of the Professional Criminologists Association of Kenya. I'm honored to have Declan today. On a personal basis, Declan is providing us at ICA Lion with intelligence and security support. And having gone through the sessions that he has taken us through and the preparedness that he has taken us through, we felt he's a perfect fit, you know, considering many of us are operating within the same environment. And so here is Declan. Declan, over to you. We are going to have about 45 minutes or so, and then we could have Q&A at the end of it. But ladies and gentlemen, please feel free to put in your questions on the chat, and we'll be able to take them as we move along. Declan, over to you. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for that introduction, Dorothy. Let me begin. So as was circulated, the kind of focus of this briefing today is what you need to know as a risk manager as it relates to election preparedness. So just a little bit about Insight. So WS Insight is an Africa-based and intelligence-driven company that's committed to changing the way that security is done in Africa. And as Dorothy has just mentioned, our Insight Information and Intelligence team leads on threat forecasting, contextual awareness, as well as bespoke solutions for commercial, diplomatic, and humanitarian clients. So that's just a little bit about us and where we're coming from. I want to kind of highlight the purpose of what I'm hoping this brief and conversation will achieve today. So first is that we want this to support risk managers to develop intelligence systems to understand, plan, and mitigate against major political risks like elections. So there will be some frameworks where it's not exclusively elections focused, but we're really going to be talking about political risk and how you can develop your own systems in order to kind of understand that space. So we're going to provide theoretical concepts, theoretical and conceptual models, as well as real-world application vis-a-vis the Kenyan elections. So we're going to make our conversation more concrete through the prism of Kenyan elections, which are next week. So we're going to discuss the role of intelligence in enterprise risk management. That's going to be kind of really key as we start looking at political risks. we'll kind of discuss and go through information sources and domains, which are really necessary for an intelligence program. And so we'll, again, make these a bit more concrete. We're going to discuss indicator and scenario-based models. This is the model that Insight is using to help advise clients and provide some coherence with regard to navigating some of these risks. We're going to discuss the scenarios and indicators that we have for Kenya's election. And we're going to talk through post-election scenarios and trigger events, as well as providing some of you some guidance and a brief kind of checklist to make sure that you're on the kind of right track. So I want to start with a quote, and I'm sure that many of you will have heard it, but we'll kind of go through. So there are known knowns, and these are things that we know that we know. There are known unknowns, that is to say, there are things that we know that we don't know. And there are also unknown unknowns, which are the things that we don't know that we don't know. And of course, this is coming from Donald Rumsfeld, right? Former Secretary of Defense from the United States. And he had basically provided this quote to media in order to understand kind of intelligence gaps. The reason I wanted to kind of start with this idea is this is a really important concept for everybody to understand when it comes to political risk, and I think risk management in general. So we know that we know certain things, and we need to make sure that we operate on that basis of knowledge. We also recognize that there are some information gaps that we have. And if we understand that there are certain things we don't know, we can still plan and navigate around that. But what's really important is there are things that we don't realize that we don't know that we probably should. And this is where an effective intelligence program comes in place. It's going to be able to speak to all three of these elements of the quote, and it's going to help you reduce your information and knowledge gap so that you can serve your organizations much better. And so I wanted to start with that as we kind of go through, and please keep that in the back of your mind. So I'd like to start by talking about information sources and some domains. So as many of you have seen before in conventional risk management models, we have internal sources of information. And these are really key for us as risk management professionals. We need to understand what they are, what they say, and how we can apply these in order to mitigate internal and external risks. When it comes to political risk, like which is the discussion today, these become really important because political risk is highly dynamic. And the internal information sources that you have, you really need to master those, understand what those are in order to apply to whatever kind of mitigation plans or other contingencies in place. One of the key things, by no means these five are not exhaustive, but a really important one that I encourage all risk managers to fully understand is staff feedback. If you work in a large enterprise, you're going to have a whole range of staff from different kind of socioeconomic and social backgrounds, and being able to know what the atmospherics are within your organization, where they're concerned, where they're not concerned, those can be vital pieces of information, because there's nobody who knows an organization as well as the people who work or operate within that. So I really encourage everybody, make sure that you understand the atmospherics around staff, and that there's feedback mechanisms regarding kind of what you do from top to bottom. Of course, there's incident reports, depending on what your kind of business is. If it's more serious in terms of, if your function is more serious in terms of security, you're going to need to know what these incident reports are and what they tell you about either gaps or lapses in procedures or awareness. So those can be really important. Another information source that's important is, what existing plans and standard operating procedures do you have? Are there gaps within that? How do you know there are gaps within that, right? And we'll talk about that in a bit. Of course, existing security reports and documents, that's essential. So where is it that the organization sees itself as it's positioned within kind of the risk scape and that environment? So those risk reports, or sometimes lack thereof, can be really helpful. And then, of course, what's important, both in a routine way as risk professionals, but particularly as we approach a really significant moment like an election or other political events, are site surveys. So that allows you to get more feedback from people. It lets you know what kind of vulnerabilities there are. It lets you know what kind of assets or things that need to be kind of protected or thought through. So that's on the internal side. The second domain is, of course, external. And this is where a lot of risk managers, I think, start falling kind of short, right? So there's really key components and sources within these external domains. The first is newspapers and media, and being able to be a responsible, discerning consumer of media. And that's a really difficult skill to achieve. But that's a really important component of understanding kind of external kind of information sources. The second is social media, similar to conventional media like newspapers, but social media provides a lot of real-time information. And if you have a finely tuned either intelligence or risk program, then you're able to kind of roll in social media findings and track those developments in a way that is going to be meaningful to your organization. Of significance is also third-party vendors, right? So people who either help provide some risk management support or intelligence support. Those people and those systems should be having their own processes to vet and understand information. They need to ultimately plug into your operation and your risk management plans in a way which is meaningful to you and your mitigation and planning strategies. So that's important. Of course, another important information source is community stakeholders, right? So that can be a whole range of different actors, whether that's in Kenya, of course, if you have a building and that's where the majority of your staff are, understanding kind of what's going on outside of the gate, maybe it's bodas, you'll have people with kiosks. That's helpful from a kind of a threat mitigation perspective. But there's a whole range of other stakeholders outside of your organization that provide really important information that you can then apply to your plans. And then, of course, official statements. Maybe that's official statements from the government, from embassies, or from a range of actors that let you know kind of what they're thinking. Of course, law enforcement or security services, depending on your specific kind of pain points or needs. But from a political standpoint and a political risk standpoint, this external information domain is so significant. So you need to really understand what these kind of 5, and of course there's more information sources are when it comes to political risk and navigating those kinds of risks. So I'm sure that everybody has seen this kind of graphic or this model before. This is what they call like the Swiss cheese model. And I want to talk about how this really applies to what we're talking about today in terms of building a program that is able to navigate around political risks like elections. So as you can see at the top, we have barriers, right? So that actually, let me start. On the left, you have threats, right? And there are some threats that we've already identified that are election or political specific, right? So civil unrest, right? What does that look like, right? Are there going to be protests? Where will the protests be? What will be the grievances that drive these kinds of protests? Will there actually not just be protests, but violence? What's the nature and shape of the violence? What's the severity? Who is it targeting? All of these questions are really important for you to understand kind of what the threats are. Another threat is infrastructure failure. That can be everything from essential services like power and electricity. It can be internet failure. It can be telecommunications and problems with that. It can be road blockages. So all of us as people within the private sector, regardless of our industry, we rely on infrastructure. And if that starts failing, then we start having disruptions to business and operational continuity. So that's another threat. Absenteeism, right? So if, for larger enterprises where they have a lot of people who are working, if you start having a situation where people aren't showing up to work or their productivity is degraded, that's another threat. It's a softer threat. It's not as aggressive as civil unrest. But in many cases, absenteeism may impact your organization more than civil unrest, depending on all those dynamics. So those are just 3 examples of threats, but there's can be many, many more. If we look toward the center, we can see barriers, right? Each of these barriers, or as you can see, these kinds of slices of Swiss cheese, they are things that you put in place to stop threats from impacting your organization. If you look at the right-hand side, these are undesired outcomes on your organization. That can look like disruption, maybe injuries or fatalities, depending on the threat, and then certainly reputational harm. And again, that will always matter on what your organization is, how involved it might be, or the perception of it. We've had organizations and companies which have continued to operate in certain environments. If we look at the situation with Russia right now, there's organizations which could have perhaps been able to continue. Maybe that's McDonald's or Starbucks or these other companies. But reputationally, if they continued operating there, it would damage the brand. So these are all things that, at least for people who've invested in Russia, they need to start thinking about that. As we move to that center, we can see that we've identified, at least for our purposes today, 3 barriers: internal, external, and process. So these are things that you can lay in place to separate and create distance between undesirable outcomes and the threat profile that you're facing. So from an internal perspective, we already mentioned staff feedback, right? Make sure you understand how staff are feeling and what those atmospherics are. That tells you as a risk manager a lot of information. It lets you know where your organization is more likely to be kind of impacted. And it lets you know whether your plans are in place to be able to manage that. Certainly, I mentioned existing risk reports, site surveys. These are all internal barriers that you, if you can understand, and if you kind of incorporate into your planning, that makes it much more effective. As we mentioned earlier, an external barrier. Really understand what conventional media is saying. The more that you have a discerning and balanced understanding of what's happening in your environment, the less political risks will creep up on you. Another component, as we mentioned, is community. Really important for you to understand where your kind of stakeholders and people who either consume your product, people who support your product, people who are in proximity to your facilities, whatever that may be. Knowing what's going on there and having a good connection with them can be really important. And then, of course, under the external side, third-party vendors, right? Very much kind of like what Insight does for a lot of our clients. We provide them comprehensive information. We let them know where we're concerned and how that might impact those organizations. And then those observations and forecasts are then rolled into client plans for action. And the third barrier, the one we haven't really touched on, but is really important, is process, right? So it's not just that you know the threat profile. It's not just that you know how you could be negatively impacted. It's also how you have a reporting structure. So the staff that we mentioned or anybody else, how are they going to report something that's concerning and make it to the right people in the right in a kind of expeditious way. And similarly, once you get that information, are you able to disseminate? Do you have the mechanisms to share that information with your organization in a timely way, in a way that's confidence-inducing rather than anxiety-inducing? So reporting and dissemination and the processes around that are really important for risk managers. You need to have a corroboration and triangulation process. So just because you get in one report that says something terrible is happening, doesn't mean you take it for face value. So you need to have systems in place that corroborate or triangulate that information so that you have more confidence of its quality and you know how to prioritize that in terms of whatever mitigation or response strategies you have. And of course, having a process in place where decisions and information can be shared and discussed in an inclusive way. So inclusivity is really important. And this is something where I observe a lot of risk managers underperforming. They think that they kind of know it all and they've got their plans in place and everything's good to go in case something happens. But if you don't have people across your organization who understand those plans, who understand kind of what those threat profiles are and how people will respond, then you're only halfway there. And so having processes around inclusivity is really important. And these are good examples about how you can prevent disruption, minimize the likelihood of injury or fatality, and then protect your organization's reputation. So we'll move to this indicator and scenario-based model that I've already alluded to, so that you can start understanding conceptually what at least we're talking about and how Insight supports many of its clients. So once you've looked at and assessed internal and external information, you can begin to start this kind of journey on developing scenarios and indicators to understand this, in this case, the political risk profile or kind of outcome of election-related events. So you really need to have robust internal and external information in order to start making decisions. From this, you can start to understand the environment much more comprehensively and develop realistic best and worst case scenarios. Similarly, you don't just want to look at either or. You want to start in the case of elections, particularly in places like Africa. You want to understand a scenario of disruption as well as a scenario of violence and how this intersects with best and worst case. And I know that that's very theoretical, but we'll make this more concrete in a moment. But you really want to understand, based off of the information that's available and your confidence with this information, how you can develop some of these scenarios. From this information, right, again, the internal and external information, you can start establishing indicators and warnings and based off of these scenarios. So what's going to take for Kenya in this case to get to the worst case scenario? What needs to occur? What needs to not occur for Kenya to reach a scenario? Similarly, what needs to occur and what needs to not occur for Kenya to achieve the best case scenario? And what does it look like in between, right? So this is why having great information and a good intelligence program will let you develop scenarios. It will let you establish indicators and warnings so that you can start having something that's a bit more concrete and effective and bespoke to your organization. And this really helps you establish baseline assessments. It means our assessment on the context is this, and these are the things that may or may not occur in the future. And obviously nobody can predict the future, but if you've established a baseline assessment, then you are going to be able to plan and navigate these issues much more effectively than people who just say, look, it could be anything, we're not sure. So these kind of four really important components feed into your ability as a risk manager to plan and mitigate risks much better. It means that you can track deviations. So for example, if you don't have a baseline assessment, then you don't know if new events shift from reality and make it better, or if it actually improves. So if you have a baseline assessment in place, and there's an event that suggests that your baseline needs to be adjusted, so that to advise people that things are getting better or worse, you really need to be able to do that. And so you can track deviations if you've done this. The things on the left-hand side, you can track deviations better. If you've done these things, then you can test your assumptions, right? Because ultimately, as risk managers, we have to build in certain assumptions. And to do our job effectively, we need to test these assumptions. And the best way to do that is either through scenarios or incorporating emergent events to see whether you're on the right track or not. Once you have baselines, once you understand what your indicators and warnings are, once you understand what the realistic scenarios are, you can communicate this much more succinctly. So you build in these things, and then you're able to speak to kind of those nodes and explain how your organization is prepared to deal with this major event, or explain why you have gaps that need to be filled and what is needed to fill those gaps. So hopefully that part's clear. We're now going to kind of take a more concrete step and show how insight is looking at the elections and what our perception are and what our indicators are. So for our first election risk indicator, we have security service conduct. Now, why is that an indicator? Well, based off of historic precedent and activities, security services have been either lackluster or counterproductive. We have, of course, for those of us in Kenya, we vividly remember what the environment was like in 2007, where police violence and gunshot was a significant exacerbating force. And there was also kind of a breakdown in command. So security service conduct can be good or bad. And so the better it is, the less likely we're going to have problems associated with the election or after the election. Similarly, our second indicator is the alignment or realignment of political parties. And so the more that we have party cohesion, the less likely we are to have drama and distractions, and political parties and coalitions are able to then kind of campaign and focus on what they need to do, rather than infighting, using hate speech and other kinds of rhetoric. So the alignment and constitution of these are really significant, and so this is why we've identified this as a risk indicator. In a similar way, party and coalition discipline and dispute resolution are really significant. So if we saw this after the primaries, if parties are able to kind of maintain discipline within their ranks and resolve through kind of an accepted mechanism, as opposed through violence or alienation, then this is a really important indicator. The formula for post-election violence is pre-election violence plus an election dispute. So if we can reduce, or if we observe that there is far less pre-election violence, then we are in a much stronger position after the election in order to kind of reduce the likelihood of unrest. The fourth indicator that we've developed is perceptions of judicial independence. So does the public believe that the judiciary is autonomous and independent, or do they believe that it's compromised? And so again, just like all of these other indicators, they can be good or they can be bad. A good, an example of good, this indicator being good would be people realizing that that judges and magistrates are basically independent and divorced from political pressure and influence. Of course, the more the public thinks that the judiciary is not independent and that it's compromised, well, that means that they are less likely to either go to the courts or to believe whatever outcomes might be there. So there's positives and there's negatives. Finally, the credibility of the IABC, very similar to the judiciary. If the public perceives the IABC to be weak, ineffective, and unable to manage or administer the election, well, then they're going to be less likely to accept the results, particularly if they perceive that result to be unfavorable. But if the public perceives the IABC to be credible, effective in administering the election, and divorced from political influence, then they're going to be more likely to accept an outcome, including an unfavorable outcome. So these are the 5 indicators that we have been tracking throughout the election period, and what we use to ultimately help develop some of our scenarios and guidance to clients. So this quadrant is what we've been using to help simplify and communicate the our scenarios for how the election will go. And so I'm sure that most of you have seen this kind of quadrant before in maths class. If you look in the upper right quadrant, you can see that we're measuring this along low levels of disruption as well as relative safety. And so this is where we would look at best case scenario. And then if you look at the lower left-hand quadrant, you can see that we're looking at things in terms of danger and then a high level of disruption. So this is what we ultimately use to begin to assess and develop some scenarios. So for our first scenario, The best case scenario, this is a situation where the country is thriving. This is where there's low levels of disruption and low levels of violence. So for example, we would see little to no police violence, and whatever kind of force that was used by police would be acceptable. Parties would be fairly well managed, and we would have an IABC and a judiciary which was perceived as credible and fair in administering their rules. That would be kind of our best case scenario. But if we flip this over and we look at the worst case scenario, this kind of cliff edge dynamic where there's a high level of disruption and there's a high threat of violence. This is when we start having a systematic breakdown in the IABC and the election systems. This is where we have security service conduct as overzealous or losing in kind of command structure. Parties are involved in infighting. We start having a breakdown in discipline within coalitions, and where we start having kind of episodic or systematic violence, similar to what we saw in 2007. Now, if we look at the best and worst case scenarios, Insight's assessment is that neither of these are likely. So we're not thinking that we're moving into a best case scenario, and we certainly don't think that the indicators are there that will have a worst case scenario, kind of like a repeat of the 2007 election. But what's important, and this is why developing indicators and scenarios is important for your organization, is that where this is going is more likely going to be somewhere in the middle space. So as risk managers, you need to understand what that middle ground looks like and how that middle ground is more likely to impact your organizations. So for the next scenario, we have a scenario which is one of fear. So there's a low level of disruption, but there is a higher level of violence. Really what this means in practical terms is we have a situation where there's going to be violence or the fear of violence in certain areas of the country, but that there's no indication yet that that violence would kind of spread beyond those certain or specific areas. So there would be a high level of fear and concern, but it's not yet impacting organizations, and it allows for more continuity. This is a situation where there's a lot of kind of police force. There's protests in certain areas. Certain communities feel as though the election was either stolen or mismanaged, and that kind of concern begins to ferment. So that's what that fear kind of scenario looks like. The other scenario is a scenario of inconvenience. So there's a high level of disruption, but a very low level of threat or violence. A good example for this is where we have a protracted election, where either it's contested or we're forced into a runoff or a rerun. That doesn't necessarily mean that there'll be violence, but it means that we're extending this election period. It means that we're extending the campaigns. There could be more intensity with campaigning. There's a whole range of things that would be disruptive, but are not necessarily violent. And so where you as organizations really need to kind of look at is where do these scenarios kind of impact you, and then how do you start planning for those particular events. So I'll give you Insight's kind of 3 key baseline assessments. And again, this is based off of us looking at internal and external resources, plotting this out on scenarios, understanding these indicators. So the first is and this is what we advise clients, that our baseline risk indicators are actually positive as we head into the election, and that pre-election violence and hate speech are less intense than forecasted, and that security services are mostly prepared. In fact, security services are better prepared for this election than any other election in memory. Does that mean that they're going to execute their mission perfectly? Certainly not. We know that there'll be gaps, there'll be mistakes, but if you look at it from a baseline perspective, they are better prepared than they've ever been. And I think that that's an important kind of point of progress to mention. Our second baseline is that there has been a significant decrease in the frequency, intensity, and severity of political violence in 2022 compared to 2017. That's based off of the data that we have collected and that we've analyzed, both in terms of, again, number and then the severity of violence. So this is, again, a really positive kind of baseline assessment that you can kind of use to forecast and extrapolate an inference from. The third is that historically election violence that has occurred has disproportionately impacted marginalized communities outside of the Nairobi. So we're talking places in peri-urban communities like Kibera and Mathare. We're talking about places upcountry like Uasin Gishu, Nakuru, of course, places like Kisumu and Mombasa. And so that's where these kind of hotspot areas have typically been, as opposed to for clients who might be living in places like Lavington or Muthaiga, or where businesses might be in certain parts of Westlands. Of course, there's always that risk of violence or unrest impacting those areas, but the real kind of frightening, brutal violence has typically occurred outside of those areas. And that's an important point to mention, depending on the client that you're advising. So in terms of the actual real life scenarios that we've developed that we wanted to share, our first scenario, we've got 4. This is a scenario where where the IABC declares a first round winner, and where the unsuccessful aspirant concedes. So this is hypothetically would be a free and fair poll where the winner meets the constitutional threshold of receiving 50% of the vote plus 1, and in terms of total votes, and then at least 25% of the vote in 24 counties. In a situation like this in this scenario, all the other kind of unsuccessful candidates concede, and then we move toward a process of inauguration. Now, we don't think that this is going to be a likely scenario, but this is certainly there, and this would be our best case scenario. The second scenario, and this scenario would be far more along the lines of having a inconvenience and a protracted election. This is when a candidate, when we move into a runoff, where a candidate emerges as the winner of the poll, but fails to attain the constitutional thresholds necessary. So that means that in this case, this means they don't get 50%. So a runoff election would need to be held before the 9th of September, and only the 2 leading candidates are able to participate in that. And in that case, a simple majority vote would be needed. So this would draw out the process and would create, quite a bit of inconvenience. Now, the third scenario, the scenario that Insight thinks is the most likely, is where the IABC declares a first round winner, but the unsuccessful aspirant legally contests the results in court. So this means that they file a petition and they say that the election was bungled, it was mismanaged, and it doesn't reflect the true will of the people, and it goes to the Supreme Court to make a determination on that case. As we saw in 2017, the Supreme Court can either validate the IABC's announcement or invalidate it, which means that a fresh election needs to be held within 60 days. So that's the third scenario. And the fourth scenario, which is our worst case scenario, is where the IABC declares a first round winner, but the unsuccessful aspirant disputes the result. And what that means is that the outcome is protested on claims of malpractices, and they do not seek legal redress, right? This is more akin to what we saw in 2007, and where mediation and intervention is very likely required. So these are how we're looking at these at the scenarios for the election. And as we've been telling clients, we think that scenario 3 is more likely. We wouldn't rule out scenario 2, but we think that there will be some sort of a legal dispute, which means scenario 1 is unlikely, and we don't think the baseline indicators for worst case scenario are in place. So those are the scenarios, and now what we're going to do is we're going to take you through some timelines of the actual elections so that you can see some trigger points and dates that we've identified. So as you can see from this is a flow chart that we provided all of our clients, and we've just broken this down for the purposes of this presentation. You can see on the 9th of August, that's voting day, that's next Tuesday. Polling stations are supposed to open at 5 and then close at 5. As many of you know, it's unlikely that this will be kind of always the case. Some polling stations will be late, the materials will arrive late, polling officials will be missing. There will be other kind of procedural issues that will force magistrates and judges to extend the hours of voting. And so that is a very common thing here. It's not necessarily cause for concern. And by and large, as we've seen this play out over time, the public has by and large been okay with that. So once people have finished voting, the IEBC is required to announce the results of the presidential election between the 9th and 15th of August, right? So we all know it's almost impossible that we will know on the 9th who's going to be president. So we figure 48 hours more before we have an official announcement. What's important is you can see on the left, this is one of those trigger events and concerns that we have. So outcome delays or the declaration of provisional results could possibly be a trigger for unrest. So this is something that we'll be watching, and we'll be looking for any delays and how people respond to those delays. So the IEBC basically has two, the IEBC basically has two choices. They can either declare a winner, that's if somebody meets the constitutional thresholds, or if nobody meets the constitutional threshold, that's 50% of the vote plus one, then we may have to move to a second election, in this case a runoff, and it would have to be sometime before September 9th. As we mentioned earlier, the disorder could be likely during these campaigns. So in this protracted, very intense environment, we might see some disorder. So in that case, we'd go to the poll. A simple majority would be needed to win. And if that's not disputed, then we would have an inauguration the first Tuesday or 14 days after the IEBC makes its declaration. That's if nobody's able to be the first round winner. However, if the IEBC says that they can declare a winner, then there's a couple of other options. So if one side, as we said in our best case scenario, were to concede, then the declared winner from the IEBC would have an inauguration 14 days after they announce those results, and that's if there's a concession. However, a disputed outcome could be another trigger for violence, and that's something, of course, we're all quite familiar with. So if the unsuccessful side disputes, then that means that they must file a legal application between the 13th and 19th of August, right? So that's 7 days after, that's within 7 days after the IEBC makes its decision. And then that legal application will go to the Supreme Court. So the Supreme Court will need to hear and determine the dispute, right? So they have 14 days to consider that dispute, right? So somewhere within the time frame between this 20th of August and the 3rd of September. This is another kind of trigger point that we've identified. There could be public frustration over the Supreme Court ruling, which might possibly fuel unrest. As we saw in the 2013 and the 2017 campaigns, the Supreme Court basically became open for an enormous amount of criticism. If you remember, some people would say judicial capture, they'd say activist judges, they talked about how foreign entities had penetrated the Supreme Court. We should expect that kind of rhetoric, and there would be a lot of kind of frustration around the IEBC during those periods. So the IEBC, again, has about two options. It can validate the IEBC findings, and if it does, then 7 days after the Supreme Court's ruling, they will have the president be inaugurated. However, if they invalidate that outcome, then like we did in 2017, then the Supreme Court will order an election 60 days after its determination. One thing we kind of saw last time was that by and large people developed some fatigue, and there was a lot of informal negotiations that started to need to take place. And there's a possibility that violence could be reduced in this scenario. After that fresh election, if it's valid, then we will have, just like we did last time, a swearing in of the new president about 14 days after the IEBC makes its announcement. So that's a lot of information, but that is the flow chart and those dates that we're looking at based off of kind of constitutional process, as well as the scenarios that we've identified. Last, what we wanted to do was provide managers and people here just some basic safety advisory. So these are things that you and your organization should have in place ahead of the election. And if you don't, then you should seriously start considering doing it, since we're about a week away. So first is having address and contact details for all staff held in a central manner, something where people can access that. You should ensure that phones and generators are prepared and charged. Really important, you should have a communication system in place internally as well as with neighbors. And this is kind of particularly guidance that we provide people at the household level. There should be a plan for staff relocation to their homes if that's required. Having a revised election-focused contingency plan, so that's something you should have already been developing. Ensure staff safety by activating those plans if they arise, and make sure that staff knows what your plans are so that they're not caught off guard. Embrace remote working if and where possible, particularly if there were to be violence or unrest. Management and company leaders should maintain a heightened situational awareness on key developments. And this is why having scenarios and indicators in place is so important. If you're not a risk manager and you're just another part of the senior leadership of the company, well, if you have like a good kind of short note on what's important, then you're able to kind of mentally make sense of that. So really developing your scenarios and indicators simply so that people can understand them is going to be so important. That will mean that there's more efficacy in following through with plans, and it will mean that people will take you much more seriously. So communicating these things succinctly will be so important for you. And then enhance staff safety by journey management planning, right? So in the case where you might be involved in kind of movement, or people might be movement, either from home to work, or if your business is involved in transport, something like that, have journey management planning in place and make sure that people know what they need to do to participate, what people need to do to comply with whatever those plans are. So with that, I will wrap up and open this up for some questions.
Well, thank you very much, Declan. Thank you for those insights and just going through, listening to you, just looking at the things that we need to do as risk managers. One, understanding the baseline assessments. And for me, personally, taking home is the fact that as I speak to our CMT, our crisis management team, many times they ask, so where did you get this information? Or why is the advice more based on this particular scenario and not the other? So just some of those aspects that you've highlighted, the fact that our security agencies are better prepared, the fact that there's a decrease in frequency and intensity of political violence cases based on what you've seen compared to 2017. I think that gives me confidence to approach my CMT with the scenarios and confidently indicate to them, what would most likely work best. I think another key takeaway for me is on the timelines. I was in a meeting this morning and people are saying, okay, so the elections are on 9th, then what happens? So I think that slide on timelines is very key for us so that we can also understand, the disruption that would be expected. And of course, the aspect of the scenarios, scenario 1 to 4. I've listened to you over time and it has not changed much from when we started having these discussions at the beginning of the year. So scenario 3 is most likely. And I think for us, what remains is what can we do and how have we mapped our plans and strategies for each of these scenarios? Should scenario 4 come about, then what will we do about it? If the worst case scenario, then what is expected of us? And I think the final one is more on what to do. And some of the discussions that we've had with a few of my peers, some of who are here, relate to things like, do we embrace remote working? And if you're speaking to your CMT, how do we confirm to them, or how do we give them confidence that remote working is best? Do we encourage staff to take leave? For example, is that an option? Do we encourage them to take leave for the next 1 week, given that maybe 1 or 2 days will actually be declared as public holidays? Or do we actually just say we shut down offices in hotspots? Some of us have offices in Nakuru, Eldoret, Kisumu, Mombasa. which have just been defined as hotspots, including from the US Embassy. So what do we do about this kind of offices? So thank you very much, Declan. Those are some of my few highlights, and I'd want to open it up to the team. Happy to take any questions. I can see one came through the chat. One was saying, is it the credibility of the IBC or perception on the public on IBC's credibility? That comes from Claire. Thank you for that, Declan. You may want to take that. Doreen asking about the training materials, will they be shared? Audrey, thank you for your feedback. Happy to take any questions. Please feel free to unmute. We have a few more minutes. Declan is here at your service. Thank you.
So I'll just start with that question around IBC credibility. Perception, in this case, perception is reality, right? So if the IBC can run the most effective election that they've ever done, and if people believe that it's rigged, then that's what matters. In reality, it will be a combination between the two. I think that people will sense if things get bungled, and if things get bungled, they won't have confidence. And so it's going to be both, but the bottom line, I think, is perception.
Okay, so perception is reality. Declan, can you share that report on areas declared as hotspots, and maybe you could just speak about, some of the hotspot areas that you're thinking about and you've seen from your analysis? And the other question is, are we imagining a scenario where there's internet shutdown? Could that happen, as has happened in other African countries in recent elections?
So for the internet shutdown, there's a couple of different things I think to recognize and think through on that. Do I think that the Kenyan government is going to pull a full Museveni and just clip the internet? I don't think that's in the cards. The international exposure, the domestic exposure to an act like that would be significantly more concerning for Kenya than any of its neighbors, right? It's important to recognize, Kenya is a leader in so much of this in terms of institutional development, in terms of freedom of expression and speech, in terms of international diplomacy. Kenya is leading on its neighbors, and so it can't get away with a lot of the things that some of its neighbors could. However, as we think about the election period and the amount of activity, as well as, I'll give you an example. Sorry, if everybody remembered during the presidential debates, there was a power blackout in parts of Western, and immediately people said, "Oh, this is a ploy," right? I don't think there's any evidence to suggest that this was, a political hit job, but people would think that. If we start having a situation where internet speed's slow, maybe some telecom or internet outages in parts of the country, people may think that that's what's happening, even if there's even if that's not what's occurred. Again, perception is reality. So yeah, plan for things slowing down, some other potential outages, but don't think that that's being orchestrated politically, because that's quite the leap.
Good. The other question, Declan, is on, let me just read that. Carol, are you on the call?
Yes, I am.
Yes. Could you check for me which other one we've not picked, please?
Sure. So there are two questions that have come through, Declan. The first one is from Harun, and he's asking, is voter importation allowed in Kenya? Because most of the politicians are saying that anyone can vote anywhere. This might cause conflict between the residents and those who are being imported. What are your thoughts? And the second question is from Catherine Nyaga, and she says, what should be the board's involvement in this process for election planning?
What was the last one? What involvement, sorry?
The board's involvement, the board of director.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so as far as I know, voter basically, as far as I know, people can't vote anywhere in the country, right? I believe that there are designated polling stations that you would have that you are assigned based off of your area of residence, and that's how it is. And your ability to vote is going to depend on whether you're on that register or not. So I don't think that that's true, based off of what I understand about the laws. Really good question in terms of board of directors. So look, so some boards are more intrusive and hands-on than other boards. But I think that in terms of best practices, the board of directors should also understand how major political risks, like elections, will impact those operations, and they need to make sure that that executives and leadership of that company have the right kind of resources and external kind of mindset to prevent groupthink, so that they can roll out their own kind of risk management procedures. So I would say that's what the board would do, just like they would with any other risks, right? So that's how I think that they should operate.
Thanks for that, Gavin. We have one more question from Faith Kamau, and she's asking, how do we get management to buy into this process? So having heard you and listened, and we want to sell this back to management, how do we get management to buy in?
So I think look, I think I'm just going to make a few assumptions that everybody on this call would be the designated risk management and compliance focal point for their organization. So the first thing to do is to start the conversation early, and to essentially say, look, this is one of our horizon strategic risks that could impact on operations and these things. And so we need to start incorporating these kinds of election or political events into our risk management framework. And what's good is to have those conversations early and to place this on radar. That means you can get resourcing and other kinds of support sooner. Because eventually you'll need either additional resources like people's time to establish, maybe this will be at the CMT level, or maybe this would be a special task force, and that kind of inclusivity takes time and resourcing. So start the conversation early, really know what it is that you're asking, and try to get into the budget, right? Because if you're going to increase costs and things, then you need to have at least 12 months out before the fiscal year.
Thank you. Maybe I can ask one question, Declan. So to what extent do you think voter apathy is playing towards us not having a heightened political scene? And then number two, do you think COVID also contributed to organizational resilience that can see us through the election period?
Mm-hmm. So look, we'll see how this kind of apathy theory plays out. I have a couple responses to it. I think a lot of this apathy has been overstated. It's true that voter registration targets were really low, historically low, but I think it's also true that political participation and consciousness is more holistic than just looking at voter registration trends. Of course, that will impact turnout, but I think that that's one thing. The second thing is, I think it's important that we not mistake apathy for normalization. It is perfectly normal for voters and a public to not feel emboldened and radicalized during an election event. So the fact that people aren't getting overly excited and animated as a deviation might actually be kind of a point of maturity and progress, rather than it be a life or death. We don't want electoral moments to be, your life or death scenario. And so the fact that we're not seeing that level of animation that we have in the past isn't necessarily apathy; it might be progress. So that's my response on the first one. On the second part, which you asked on. Sorry, help me with that question again.
Whether COVID helped us to build organizational resilience, that could help us through this.
I think it absolutely did, right? I think that organizations are far more comfortable with remote work. Yeah. I think that because COVID was such an impactful event, that people are more risk conscious. I think that the risk management frameworks within organizations and how those get activated is much more familiar to all staff. So I think it was I think the companies here are really well positioned to be able to have effective management programs for the election.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Gavin. Burning question, will the deck be available for everyone? I think everybody's very keen to chew on this material that you've provided.
I think potentially we can, yeah, I'll have to go through it, but hopefully people took good notes.
Thank you so much, Gavin. Dorothy, back to you.
Yes, just wanted to thank you very much, Declan, for the time that you have spent with us. I think just, you know, there's a slide on the scenarios, which in my opinion is a very good one to start buying within the next 1 week or so, so that we can also guide our CMTs, our leadership teams in terms of the actions to be taken. So on the question on what to do, I think that's, for me, a key takeaway, just understanding those scenarios and being able to articulate them, articulate what is most probable, and then, of course, indicate the plans under each of those. So thank you. I just want to hand it back to Carol to just give us a minute on the IRM. I've had a couple of questions coming to my inbox directly. So Carol, and then we close. Thank you very much.
Okay. So thank you so much, Declan and Dorothy. And just to close out, to all the people who have joined, thank you so much for joining in, and I hope it has been useful. As Dorothy has mentioned, we are the IRM regional group. We represent IRM within East Africa. And for those who might be interested, we have a number of courses that are available for you to take. If you're interested in just a short or specialized courses, we have a certificate that you can do in 1 year. We also have specialized certificates, whether it's in digital, supply chain, and other financial services, for example. If you're looking for an in-depth course to deepen your understanding of enterprise risk management, we also have diploma courses as well. And if you're looking for a short course for your teams, for your board of management, we also have the fundamentals of risk management course, which can be offered in a blended manner, both locally and abroad. So we welcome you. Yes, there's definitely a calendar of IRM events. If you go to www.irm.org, Dorothy had put that on the chat. Please do log on to the website. There's a wealth of information, both of events in the future and also just information that you can use for your day-to-day work and learning. So again, thank you so much for attending. I wish you all the best. We will meet on the other side of the elections, hopefully stronger and better. Thank you once again, and have a lovely day.
Thank you. Thank you all. Bye. Thank you, Declan.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.